So, Hollow Knight is one of my favorite games ever. It just has sort of a pull on me that constantly brings me back into the world of Hallownest to keep experiencing it more and more. Which is a pretty big achievement considering the fact that one of the game's core aesthetics is its challenge, and I'm really bad at video games and hate having to deal with a game being too difficult. But the thing is, I don't love Hollow Knight in spite of its incredible difficulty. It's actually one of the things I love about Hollow Knight the most. But why is that? Could it be that I have finally ascended and become a real gamer who understands that the more obscenely challenging a game is, the better it is, and that everyone who wants to play on easy mode is a whiny little bitch not worth the time of day? No, people who think like that are idiots. Making a game more difficult does not inherently make it better, it's how a game handles difficulty that makes it good, and Hollow Knight handles difficulty so well that even an easy mode playing whiny little bitch like myself can fall in love with it. But how does it do this? Well, remember just now when I said core aesthetics? That's not a term I just made up. You see, there's a game design paper called Mechanics Dynamics Aesthetics, or MDA, that defines, among other things, the aesthetics of a game, or the reasons we enjoy them. There are about 8 or so core aesthetics, but most of them aren't really important when talking about Hollow Knight, but if you want to learn more about them, there's a good extra credits video about it that I'll link in the description. I'm just gonna spend my time talking about these two. Challenge and discovery, the latter of which I'm going to call exploration because I like that term better. These are the two core aesthetics of Hollow Knight, though you could argue sensation as a third, and the game uses them so well that they each manage to elevate the other to new heights. The first way these two dynamics work together is pretty obvious. Because moving through the world is challenging, it feels more rewarding to successfully move through it, and while exploring is usually very challenging, it's never so much that it makes you want to give up. That's pretty basic and it's not really worth lingering on here. Something that is worth lingering on, however, is the game's combat system. It starts out incredibly limited, with you only having basic movement options like walking, jumping, and the ability to swing your nail. However, as you progress, you gain more upgrades, most of which affect how you move through the world, which makes the game's combat increasingly aerial as time goes on. By the endgame, you've collected so many movement-based upgrades that in the final challenge of the Colosseum of Fools, one of the last parts of the game's content, there are long stretches where you have to fight enemies without having any platforms to land on, and that includes the ground, which has been replaced with killer spikes. And while this part is very challenging, it's incredibly doable, provided you've been learning how to use all your upgrades properly. But what if you haven't learned how to use all your upgrades properly? What if you've been relying on one or two abilities that you really like and never learned how to use the others properly? Well, guess what? You haven't been. And we're finally getting around to talking about how the game's exploration factors in to explain why. As I mentioned before, most of the upgrades in the game, at least most of the ones that you'll actively use, alter your ability to move in some way, like the Mantis Claw that lets you wall jump, the Mothwing Cloak that lets you dash, or the Monarch Wings, my personal favorite upgrade, which lets you double jump. Every time you get an upgrade, the game teaches you the ropes of how to use it by immediately throwing several obstacles at you that you can only overcome by using your new upgrade. However, this is only there to teach you the controls of the upgrade and make sure you don't forget. It's not the game's way of actually teaching you how to properly use the upgrades in most situations. The way Hollow Knight actually teaches you how to properly use the upgrades you'll find is very simple: exploring. With the way the world is set up, you will actively need all of your upgrades to explore, and even if you go back to an area that you managed to get through just fine without your newest upgrade, the well-made movements you're now able to do will help you move through the world faster and more efficiently, sometimes even unlocking secrets that you couldn't get to before. Essentially, you will constantly be using every one of your movement upgrades, and by constantly using your upgrades, you will naturally get better at moving without even realizing it, just by playing the game. And that doesn't just apply to upgrades, it also applies to the very basic movement options the game gives you, most notably the ability to swing your nail down while you're in the air, allowing you to hit an enemy and bounce at the same time. And because the combat system is so based in movement, the natural increase in your skill at moving automatically makes you better equipped to take on challenges. For an example of how well the game is able to teach you to move and how that translates into combat, take my fight against Hornet in my most recent playthrough. At this point in the game, I don't have any upgrades besides the Vengeful Spirit, which is one of the upgrades that doesn't help you move. Despite that, I'm still very easily able to avoid Hornet's attacks and frequently take advantage of strikes from above. And while it wasn't that hard for me to beat Hornet this time after already beating the game, the first time I played this game, it was incredibly difficult for me to fight Hornet. I lost like 8 times and Hornet felt so difficult that if you told me how difficult the game would later be, you'd get to see the color drain from my face as I died from fear. And while part of my improvement is due to memorizing Hornet's attack patterns, It'd still have been pretty hard to take advantage of that if the game hadn't taught me how to move better. Exploration also teaches you how to use your movement upgrades better through the enemies you find, and a lot of them have attack patterns designed around teaching you how to use your movement options to fight. For instance, the Mantis warriors that can be found in Fungal Wastes mainly attack while dashing towards you. This, in turn, teaches you ways to use your own dash in combat, because the only way to avoid the Mantis' dash is to either dash away from it or dash over it to get to the side it's not attacking. There's also enemies with shields like the Moss Guardians that teach you the value of attacking from above, because they'll block every attack you make on them until right before they attack. At which point, if you're standing in front of them, they're guaranteed to hit you, so the only way to hit them without taking damage is to use a downward strike and bounce on them until they're open. Or there are things like the Elder Balder, that are specifically designed to be killed by one particular upgrade, in the case of the Elder Balder, the Vengeful Spirit. There are also Warrior Dreams that can be killed by any attack, but because most of them float above you, their design encourages you to use the Howling Wraiths. In addition, a lot of the enemies you can find and fight are designed with attack patterns similar to but weaker than the bosses, so finding and fighting them trains you to fight the bosses. For example, fighting the Husk Guards and their big clubs teaches you to avoid the False Knight's mace. Or how the attack patterns of the different Mantis enemies you fight are each similar to one attack the Mantis Lords have. So up until now, I've mostly been talking about fairly subtle ways the game helps you play it better without even realizing what you're doing. But there's one moment in Hollow Knight that manages to completely alter the way you think while playing it. Essentially, when you get to the Fungal Wastes, the game's third main area, you aren't able to go to a new area until you get the wall jump from the Mantis Village. But because at this time, you'll have already sunk so much time into the Fungal Wastes, you keep exploring, especially because the area has a very vertical design, so unlocking the wall jump feels like an incentive to keep exploring. This naturally leads you to discovering the Mantis Lords, the boss fight at the bottom of the Mantis Village, and the Mantis Lords are going to kill you. They are so hard at the time, there's very little chance of you beating them unless you're already an expert at playing the game. To give you an idea of how hard they were, when I started a new game to record footage, after already having beaten 4 of the 5 boss rush modes, I decided to see if I could actually beat the Mantis Lords, and I lost because I didn't have enough upgrades. And losing to the Mantis Lords here is paramount, because when you go back to the Mantis Lords, which you will do because you've gotten used to dying against bosses and want to give the Mantis Lords payback, you'll find the NPC Quirrell on the way to the Mantis Village. Quirrell will tell you that the Mantis Lords are probably too hard for you right now, and remember, he's right, so you should go to the City of Tears, another area the game's already shown you the entrance to, because there, you can find someone who will make your nail more powerful. I cannot state how great and important this moment is. Prior to this, you've had the mindset that you will have to beat certain bosses to progress, because you had to beat Hornet to get the dash upgrade that lets you reach other areas, but this moment completely changes your thought process. Quirrell has just told you that if you're having too much trouble with a boss, you can leave, and not only are there other things you can do instead, but you can find upgrades that will actively help you fight the boss that you are currently struggling against. And this completely shifts how you think about the game from, I'll explore until I find a boss and then I'll fight it till I beat it, to, I'll explore all I want and if I find a challenge too hard for me, I can keep exploring instead and that will help me find things that will help me overcome this challenge. This makes the game seem much less tedious and frustrating to players, because if they get stuck on something, not only do they know that they can do something else, but they know that doing something else will actively help them do the thing they're stuck on, so they never feel like they aren't making any progress. For instance, in my first playthrough, I remember getting to the second Hornet fight, and it killed me. I lost repeatedly, and I thought, if only I had more charm notches, charms being the equipable items that each have different effects that help you fight or move better, and notches being what's required to equip charms, then I'd be able to use more power-ups and I'd be able to beat this fight. So I left the area where the fight happens and I went exploring, and what do you know, I found an entire shop dedicated to charms and charm notches that I'd missed before. So I bought all the notches I could afford, equipped more charms, and after a few more attempts, I beat Hornet. And in addition to helping you find more upgrades, because exploring trains you to be better at the game, your new exploration focused mindset will actively help you be better at the game even if you can't find new upgrades. But that all leads me to my final point. All of this doesn't just make Hollow Knight incredibly good at handling challenge and a well-designed game, it actively increases the impact Hollow Knight leaves on its players and makes challenge-based games more accessible for them. For this point, I will be using myself as an example, which I totally haven't been doing this entire video, most recently like 5 seconds ago, and since I haven't been talking about my personal experience so far, just irrefutable facts, me telling a story about what I did my first time playing the game should be a nice change of pace. You see, one of my favorite bosses in the game are the Mantis Lords, and just to be clear, as hard as the Mantis Lords were the first time you encounter them, they're not the toughest bosses in the game. Not by a long shot. But I can remember my first time trying to fight them, not listening to Kroll's warning at first and dying repeatedly, before reluctantly accepting his advice and running away to the City of Tears to get an upgrade for my nail. And while I was there, I got that nail upgrade. I saw a cutscene, I even fought a new boss for an extra upgrade, but the entire time I was thinking about the Mantis Lords, even if it was just at the back of my mind. And when I crawled my way out of the City of Tears, newly acquired upgrades in hand, the first thing I did was go back to the Mantis Lords, and the challenge was tough, and I died a good few more times, but eventually, I beat those Mantis Lords. And my reward for doing so wasn't just an upgrade or a charm notch, it was an entire new area of the game. And in that moment, I felt so good, because I'd finally beaten those monsters haunting my thoughts, responsible for killing me over and over again. And I'd gotten one of the best rewards the game could have possibly given me for it. And if Hollow Knight was a typical challenge-based game, I wouldn't have felt nearly as good. Sure, beating a boss that had repeatedly killed me would be satisfying, but the experience was just so much richer when I had to accept defeat and leave, causing me to be so much more invested in the fight when I returned, because it was the fight that I had been completely unable to win. It's moments like this that set Hollow Knight's challenging boss fights apart from those you'd find in other games. And this approach doesn't just make the game more satisfying at times, it makes it much more accessible to people who haven't played games this challenging before, and all of that made me so much more invested in Hollow Knight's challenge than I have been in any other games. I mentioned before that I've beaten 4 of the game's 5 boss rush modes. These boss rushes are incredibly difficult, and in basically any other game, I would never be this dedicated to its optional extra challenges. But in Hollow Knight, I'm still making regular attempts at the game's 5th boss rush, because I just love the challenges Hollow Knight provides that much. Not only that, but Hollow Knight has made me actively interested in other challenge-based games like Dark Souls that I would have never thought about playing before, because I didn't think I could enjoy something that hard. But thanks to Hollow Knight, I now see challenge in a whole new light, and I think that's pretty cool.